would still take a little sip of it before you decide how much water you want to add to it. It is really light, it is really, really fruity. So it might not need any water if you guys don't think that it needs any water. A drop of water probably wouldn't hurt it.
This is great. You know, I got a couple of bottles of Scotch Macallan.
We still have a couple
30 years old, 40 years old.
Yep.
And they're basically buying the Scotch from. Is there a shortage on this here?
Might be. This is from the Little Mill Distillery. So as Don's bringing this one around, the name that you'll see most prominently on the bottle, and we'll see it with these Duncan Taylors and with the signatory here later, the name at the top, the Scott's, that's the warehouse that it's sitting in. Those are the owners of this particular barrel, but Scott's isn't the distillery. This is made at the Little Mill Distillery.
They do the aging?
Yes.
They do the aging. Yeah. So they're basically buying this Scotch from other distilleries.
They're buying Scotch from other distilleries.
They're like Murray and
McDavid, Duncan Taylor, Signatory Chieftains, all those different independent bottlers, yeah.
Got it.
So what happens with this, so if 90% of all, or 93% of all the Scotch goes into blends, I was just talking to the good doctor, I was like, I feel like I already said this once today. What happens is, Pernod Ricard, or let's say Diageo owns 27 single malt Scotch distilleries, and they make Johnny Walker. And Johnny Walker, the recipe has been the same for 150 years, but they didn't own 27 Scotch distilleries 150 years ago. John Walker and Sons didn't own any Scotch distilleries, so they would go out and buy barrels from all kinds of different distilleries to create the Johnny Walker blend, to create everything that's in that stable. So that remains true to this day. So the recipe for Johnny Walker is a little bit more static. The bulk of what goes into Johnny Walker blends would be Cardew, but you guys know Diageo owns Talisker, Oban, Kleinlich, Lagavulin, Cardew. They own all of those distilleries, but there are whiskeys that go into Johnny Walker that they do not own the distilleries. So they still have to buy and sell and trade with other distilleries in Scotland and other huge companies in Scotland. Pernod Ricard owns 12 distilleries, but they don't own everything that goes into the Chivas blend. So they have to sell some of their product or trade some of their product to get the other whiskeys to put into Chivas so that Chivas can be consistent. And that's very, very common. Every distillery.
And is Chivas grain alcohol?
Oh yeah, Chivas is all blends. Yeah, I love Chivas. Chivas is going to be a lot of Strathyla, I mean a lot of really, really good single malt, but then you've got some grain alcohol and some water in it as well. So what happens with like these Duncan Taylors, like we were talking about before, the next one we're going to have is a Macallan, but this doesn't look like any other Macallan you've ever had because this barrel in particular was sitting in the Duncan Taylor warehouse. So what happens is your master blender, we're not tasting one tonight, let's say we're talking Talisker. There's a ton of Talisker in Johnny Walker Black, and there's even more Talisker in the Double Black because Talisker is an island distillery, it's a little bit peaty, a little bit briny. So what will happen is the master blender, typically master blenders don't even taste. They literally just have the strongest noses in the industry. So they might get a pallet of Talisker barrels at 10 years old that they're evaluating to see if they're going to fit into Johnny Walker Black, which is typically 12 years old. And they'll go through and nose 60 barrels of Talisker. And they're going to be inconsistencies. Even if they're sitting right next to each other, those barrels are going to nose and taste completely differently. So they'll go through and just based on nose, they might reject 5 of 60 barrels, they might reject 20 of 60 barrels, they might not reject any. But the point is that Diageo, they don't really care about their single malts, to be totally honest with you. That's such a small part of the business. Diageo cares about Johnny Walker. They care about making Johnny Walker consistent, you know, consistent quality, which is high quality, and getting that money for it all the time. So all the master blender is doing, they're not evaluating for bad or good Scotch. By the time that it gets to the blender, that barrel of Talisker is good. Does it fit into the Johnny Walker Black recipe? So they're not evaluating this is good, this is bad, dump it down a drain or put it into the blend. They're literally just saying, this is good, this is different. So in a lot of cases, those barrels that are rejected, they might actually be the highest quality Talisker or the highest quality Springbank or Macallan. They don't fit into what the blender is looking for. So we like to call those orphan barrels. So let's say they reject 5 of 60 barrels of Talisker, and then he goes through and he evaluates a whole bunch of Macallan. Then he goes through and he evaluates a whole bunch of Lefroy, just looking for what's going to fit into the blend. Everything that doesn't fit gets set off to the side. They're all orphan barrels, and then they go to people who are called independent bottlers. So the Scott's family, the Duncan Taylor family, the Murray McDavid family, the Signatory family, the Chieftains family. There's a pecking order amongst those groups, and that pecking order, the very, very top of it is going to be a group of independent bottlers that own a distillery, because they have something to play with. It's not about the money. You know, it's not about who can offer me the most money for this barrel. They would rather have Scotch in exchange for that barrel. So in the case of Signatory, the very last one that we're going to try, Andrew, that owns Signatory, owns Edredauer. So he can trade people barrels of Edredauer to go into their blend for barrels that don't fit into whatever their blend is. So that's what happens all the time. So this Scots is this is actually the company that we work for. Those brothers, this is our import company brings this in. So I actually get to pick the Scots barrels. So when I go to Scotland here in May, I'll go through all of these warehouses looking for things specifically for the United States market, for the Illinois market, for the Chicago market, you know, for whoever it is. I've worked for a number of these companies for a long time, just looking for unique things. So they have, like at the Signatory warehouse, he has 15,000 barrels. Our Scots warehouse has 1,200 barrels. It's really small. But literally just go through and look at the ends of the barrels. And in particular, this one, the thing that got me really excited about it, and this one's been since 2004, is that this is from Little Mill. And the Little Mill distillery, most people have never heard of before. Little Mill closed in 1983. So this is some of the last distillate that went through that distillery. The reason for it closing, this is a lowland whiskey. Most people have not tasted lowland whiskey. There are only 3 operating distilleries in the lowlands right now, so Auchentoshan, Glenkinchie, and Bladnoch. And Bladnoch is independently owned by a crazy Irish person, and they just started distilling again, so you're not going to see a lot of Bladnoch on the market. Auchentoshan is owned by Yamazaki Suntory. That's the one that you kind of see regularly. Glenkinchie is owned by Diageo, and Diageo puts the bulk of Glenkinchie into its blends. So you don't see very many lowland whiskeys. Up until World War II, over half the distilleries in Scotland were in the lowlands, and the lowlands are basically south of Edinburgh and Glasgow. So that whole half of Scotland, there used to be 100 distilleries. Now there are 3. The reason for that is during World War II, we had all these soldiers coming home who had been exposed to Scotch all over the world. Scotch industry really started booming. And where they were being made in the lowlands when they were being produced and consumed very near there. So you can grow barley in the south of Scotland. So people, the farmers, were using their excess barley to make beer, using their excess barley to distill and turn into Scotch. But the bulk of it was either sold to blenders or consumed on premise. As we went through World War II, and they started considering exporting more blends and exporting more single malt, what became more important was not where the barley was being grown or where the distilleries were, but where all the transportation channels were. And that's all the way up in the north central part of Scotland. That's where the ships are coming in and out of, that's where all the railways run through. And also, even as you're tasting this, I know it's 62% alcohol, it's still very delicate. This is 20-year-old whiskey, incredibly fruity. So imagine if we took, we're a blender, 93% of all single malt is made to go into blends. If you take this and dump it in a barrel of Ardbeg together, you can't taste any of this, none of it. None of those notes translate through. So the impetus was on everyone to create stronger and stronger, you know, flavor profiles for their single malts. So most of the lowland distilleries did not survive World War II because there just isn't much use for them in blends. Yeah.
When you, seriously, when you go to Scotland, do you take groups with you or do you just go on your own or what?
I have. When I was at the Dell, I used to take 2 groups a year. But I haven't done that in 3 years.
So when you do take a group, do you just go to the different distilleries or what?
I love it. He was just asking if I've ever taken groups to Scotland. I used to do it twice a year. From 2003 to 2010, I did it twice a year. And it's really funny because sometimes it's like, I know we do have one other fantastic woman here drinking with us tonight, but it's not typically a female thing. So these guys, the only way that they could go on a 2-week trip with me is if their wife could come. And then their wives think that we're going to go to like bird sanctuaries, or like tree factories. No, I don't have time for that. I want to see 2 or 3 distilleries a day. And like day 3, the women are just like, you either decide that you like Scotch, which most of them did eventually, or they would just rent their own car and go do their own thing for the whole rest of the trip. And they were just miserable. Yeah. Well, and we don't do a lot of golfing. I love golf, but that's also not what I'm there for. Yeah, exactly. You just want to drink. And we have a driver, and actually my driver's name is William Wallace. And he's wonderful. He used to work at the Berclotti distillery, and he knows a lot of the distillers, and he's great. He's driven my trips since 1998. His best friend growing up in school was named Robert Bruce. So, no, I'm dead serious. Willie is so funny. He's wonderful. So like if anybody wanted to go over, Willie will take trips anytime. Like you could get a group of guys together or your wives or whatever, Willie will take you all over the place. He's good fun. I can give you his email address. He's fantastic. So anyway, so this Little Mill, this distillery closed in 1983. We were going through a huge recession in the United States. That really caused, that actually caused just over 30 distilleries to close between 1981 and 1984. Most of them did not reopen. I think out of the original 31 that closed, I think 6 have reopened since then. And in the case of Little Mill, they bulldozed it. It's completely gone. There's a grocery store. There's like a Safeway or something there now. So really, really sad because the spirit is fantastic. I mean, really, really great whiskey. And you'll still see bottles of it pop up on the market every once in a while. I have a few of like the original ones in our warehouse, and it's really, really gorgeous.
Usually alcohol does better during a recession.
Not this stuff.
That's true.
So this one, I think for being 62.1%, we can all agree, still really delicate, really approachable. It can stand a drop of water. Wherever. Are you typing it? And the reason for adding water, and you can chill this if you really wanted to, but like I said before, you chill the flavors of things that you don't like. We drink Bud Light at 33 degrees because Bud Light tastes like crap. I mean, if you taste it at 70 degrees, at room temperature, you can tell that the quality of the ingredients isn't there. But we can drink Guinness warmer because Guinness is really good beer. With something like this Little Mill, if you think about it, this is 62.1% alcohol, which makes it 37.9% water. Alcohol is lighter than water, so you have 2/3 of this glass is just straight alcohol sitting on top of water. So we naturally swirl things. Swirling isn't going to do anything for this. It's not going to oxidize it. There's too much water in there, or too much alcohol in there. But if you add a drop of water, that water basically wants to join the rest of the water, so it actually does break up that surface tension and actually kind of allow it to oxidize. So even just a drop of water will change the flavor of it a little bit. And in some cases, I would say be particularly careful. The older the whiskeys are, you can flatten them very quickly with water. And if they're very heavily sherried, really, really dark, been aged in a sherry barrel forever, they'll get sulfury very, very quickly with water. So you want to be careful with it. So you see a lot of people with eyedroppers and all that kind of stuff. Are you jealous of our whiskey? Do you need some whiskey?
We need to try that.
Do you want to just get on the same page? And then we can go back and revisit cognac later. They're all watching me. Did he get the same amount as you? Did he get more?
Make sure he's old enough.
Don't worry about that. What? Are you serious? You related to that girl?
Well, he's his.
Oh! Yeah.
He takes after his mom. He's okay.
So how's the Little Mill? And like I said too, this is one of the rarest scotches that you can taste. And like I said, behind my bar, I had 900 single malts. At any given point in time, I maybe had 3 or 4 Little Mills. Very, very rare to ever get to taste one. In the entire Scott's warehouse, we had 2 barrels of Little Mill the entire time I was there. You do not see these very often. The other one to look for if you like kind of these lowland flavors, Auchentoshan's really good, Glenkinchy's really good. If you can get a hold of some older Bladnock, we have a little bit of it, really beautiful. Little Mill's great. The other distillery down there that is very famous and heavily collected is called Rosebank. If you ever see a Rosebank on the market, they're fantastic. Really light, fruity, floral.
Drink the bottle.
I think I You can get one. You're welcome.
Extra one.
Okay. Okay. McAllen fans in here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is gonna, I want everyone's honest opinions on this McAllen. I love it, but I picked the barrel, so.
Only chilled will kill the flavor.
Yeah. Okay, so the McAllen that's coming around right now, you guys are familiar with McAllen. It's always really, really dark. We had a big, long conversation about it. It's typically aged 100% in first fill Oloroso sherry barrels. Who drinks sherry? You guys, some people are kind of familiar with sherry?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Yeah? A little bit. Okay. If we would all drink more sherry, we could have more sherried whiskeys. Right now, think about it, there weren't a lot of bourbon drinkers even 30 years ago, 40, 50, 60 years ago. You had lots of sherry and port drinkers though. So sherry is just a fortified wine that comes from Jerez, or it comes from the Sherry Triangle in the southwest of Spain. Before I moved here, the beginning of last year, I lived in Jerez for 1.5 years making and blending sherry. I love sherry. I don't drink enough of it to support, the whole rest of the market. We've seen this huge explosion in bourbon. So bourbon is incredibly popular right now, and rye whiskey, things like that. So in the United States, they passed a law in 1984. The Coopers Union, Coopers are the guys that make the barrels. So the Coopers Union lobbied the government to pass a law that said that we could only use a barrel once to age bourbon. So it has to be a fresh barrel. It could never have held anything before. So that law passed. We can't use those barrels again, which means they go to brewers, they go to tequila distilleries, they go to wineries, but the bulk of them go to Scotland, Scotland and Ireland. The reason for that, we make tons and tons. Empty? You're crazy.
He didn't
I know, I'm worried.
nailed it.
This is great scotch. We'll have to come back to you with that one. So the reason that they're aging so much more in bourbon, we're making lots of bourbon, which means the barrels are not expensive. So a typical bourbon barrel is going to be a 53-gallon barrel, hold about 350 liters of spirit, something like that. We can ship a bourbon barrel whole to Scotland for under $100. They cost between $75 and $80 shipped whole to Scotland. That's crazy to me. Shipping and everything. And granted, they're buying thousands of them at a time because we can only use them once. A sherry barrel right now costs 2,200 to 2,500 euros shipped whole. So if you were drinking Scotch 200 years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, 60 years ago, everyone was drinking sherry. So sherry barrels were less expensive and they only had to come from Spain. So it wasn't that difficult a journey. You just hop on a boat and go over. Now, nobody's drinking sherry. And everybody's drinking bourbon. So there's been a complete shift in the market. So I will very often have people tell me, Macallan tastes completely different now than it did 30 years ago. It does. Most whiskeys do. That's two reasons behind that. One is there aren't as many sherry barrels or as high quality sherry barrels. Then you would have had much more vintage sherry. Now, companies like Macallan and Glenfarclas that age in sherry barrels all the time, they literally build the barrels themselves, lease them to sherry wineries so that the sherry can go in and season the barrels, and then sometimes the sherry's just dumped down the drain. There isn't even enough of a demand for cooking sherry to keep up with it. So before, where people were drinking 8, 10, 20-year-old sherry, now they can barely keep it in there for 2 years before it has seasoned the barrel, and then the barrel goes back to the gallon. So they're dumping the bulk of sherry down the drain right now. There's just absolutely not a demand for it. So where 40, 50 years ago you were drinking Scotch that was almost exclusively aged in sherry barrels, and it was old, high quality, really, really good sherry, now there's been a complete shift. Now 85% of all Scotch going into barrel goes into bourbon barrels. 12% goes into sherry barrels, 3% goes into other oak barrels. We'll have one that was aged in Bordeaux. You can literally, the law says oak barrel. So that barrel could previously have held anything. So very often you will see port, Madeira, Malaga, Claret, Zinfandel, Muscatel. I've seen white Zinfandel before, Tokai. Really, really goofy wines. The Glenmurray Chardonnay. I think a lot of you have had that Glenmurray. I know Dennis has sold more of it than anyone in the state.
Yeah.
That was exclusively aged for 10 years in French Chardonnay barrels. Absolutely beautiful whiskey. So you kind of have to ask yourself, like, what does that wine do for the whiskey? I mean, it adds color, but it definitely adds flavor. In the case of this Macallan, what makes this completely different, you can tell by the color, this was aged in a bourbon barrel. So every Macallan you've ever had before was aged in either exclusively Oloroso sherry barrels or a combination of bourbon, first fill sherry and second fill sherry. So Macallan has never bottled a 100% bourbon barrel aged whiskey. So to me, what's kind of scary is if you really like Macallan, that traditional Oloroso flavor, you're not going to find that here. But this is really bright, really beautiful. I mean, distillate. I mean, all the same. It's really, really nice. So this would have gone into the Macallan Fine Oak 15.
Yeah, sure.
For whatever reason, 55.1% alcohol. The blender didn't think that it fit into what they were looking for Macallan 15. I'm glad that they didn't. This to me is so fruity, and you don't get those bright fruits. You typically get a lot of berries and red fruits from Macallan because of all the Oloroso. This to me, tons and tons of like apple and almost tropical fruit, like approaching pineapple and things like that. I love it. It's 55.1% alcohol. Word of McPhail, this was, total number of bottles out of this barrel was 257 bottles. So when these go in, 55.1.
That's all natural.
That's all natural. Yeah, 55% alcohol. So this would have gone into the barrel. Typically whiskey goes into the barrel at 67.5% alcohol. That's not a law, but it is industry standard. Because the bulk of whiskey is sold to blenders, that's called blending strength. You have to be able to sell the same proof across the board. So typically when it goes in the barrel, it goes in at 67.5. In 15 years, this lost 12%. You typically